Hi, everyone. I'm Maggie McGrath, editor of Forbes Women. On Monday, President Donald Trump issued a warning to pregnant Americans to not take Tylenol. He is claiming that there are ties between the use of Tylenol while pregnant and an increase in autism cases in the United States. Following this press conference, the American College of OB-GYNs issued a strongly worded statement against what the president had said. And joining me now is Dr. Stephen J. Fleischman. He's an MD and the president of ACOG. Dr. Fleischman, thank you so much for joining us.
Thank you for having me on the show.
So Donald Trump said a lot of words. It's a 39-page transcript when I printed it out from Monday's press conference. I'm just going to read a few of them. He said, Tylenol can be associated with a very increased risk of autism, so taking Tylenol is not good. All right, I'll say it, it's not good. End quote. Dr. Fleischman, what is your response to that as a clinician, and what is ACOG's response to that?
So to be clear, I think that we are still recommending that acetaminophen be used, which is the active ingredient in Tylenol, when needed in pregnancy. I think the most interesting thing that came out of that statement was essentially saying, we're saying only use it if medically necessary. And I don't think that that's out of line with what we are saying also. I just think the terms he used to say never use it, or I think he even said, buck up or something along those lines, or just deal with it. I think, in general, Tylenol, acetaminophen has been studied for over 20 years. People have been looking for an association between acetaminophen and autism for a really long time, and the studies just don't bear that out. And so to say that there's an association, sure, there have been some studies over the years that show that people who are exposed to acetaminophen in utero have a slightly higher risk, and I mean slightly higher risk. But more importantly, the best studies that have been done to date, which are larger trials, including one done that was published last summer from Sweden, which looked at over 2.5 million pregnancies, and they actually controlled for the genetic components of it by looking at siblings in particular, and showed that mothers who took acetaminophen during pregnancy with one sibling, but not with the other, that there was no increased risk of autism in the offspring, and no difference.
So you referenced that large study in Sweden. Do you know what academic studies, peer-reviewed studies that the president and his administration may have been looking at? Because what I'm getting at is, where does this warning against Tylenol come from? Is there a basis in science for what we heard from the White House?
Sure. So the basis for where they're drawing all of their conclusions was a meta-analysis that was recently published. And a meta-analysis is where you take many different studies and compile all of the patients into one analysis. So let's say there's 25 studies that have been done over the last 20 years, maybe more. They chose a certain number of studies, they pooled all those together, and then tried to see if by getting a larger sample size, did they somehow come out with an association. And in that meta-analysis, there is a slight association between taking acetaminophen during pregnancy and autism. And I say association because I think it's a really important thing for our viewers, for patients, for my patients to understand. Association is not causation. And I think even the authors of that study in their conclusions say association, not causation. And the reason I say this, for example, no one takes acetaminophen in pregnancy if they feel fine. People who are healthy don't generally take acetaminophen. But if you have a fever in pregnancy, if you have a headache, if you have some chronic pain or other thing that requires it, you will take it. So the question becomes, did the acetaminophen cause the problem, or was it the underlying disorder that led for the need to take acetaminophen? And we know that fevers early in pregnancy can lead to anomalies. We know that it affects development of the fetus. And so I think many of us think that association, and the reason we're not saying causation, is we haven't seen a study to date that shows a causal relationship between acetaminophen and autism.
No study to date that shows a causal relationship between acetaminophen and autism. I want to go back to something you said about fevers in pregnancy, because throughout the press conference, the phrase tough it out was used more than once. And I want to ask you, from from your perspective as a doctor, what happens to a pregnant person if they experience a fever and do not take a painkiller? What happens to their body, and what happens to the body of their baby?
So most pregnant women know they shouldn't go in a hot tub. They shouldn't, that the heat and overheating your body early in pregnancy, when that early embryo is developing into a fetus, we know that fevers in that early period of time, when the internal core body temperature rises, that can result in cardiac anomalies, what we call craniofacial, like cleft lip, cleft palate, and CNS abnormalities. Now we know those things, but do we know for certain that if it's impacting enough to cause an anomaly, might it also be associated with a neurodevelopmental problem? So I think, in my opinion, I would much rather have my wife, my daughters, any family member take acetaminophen early in pregnancy to prevent an ongoing fever than to allow that fever to persist. There, as I've said, no causal studies to show acetaminophen leads to autism. There are studies that show high fevers lead to abnormalities. And so I think when you're weighing those risk benefits, that's a conversation you have with your physician. And if you have a low grade temperature, if someone's 99.9 and they say they feel warm, that is not what we're talking about. But if you have a real fever, you should not tough it out. That is terrible advice, and really, reckless is the only word I can think of.
Reckless is a word that you are using. I'm also wondering what you are hearing from patients right now. You see patients. Are they confused? Are they avoiding Tylenol? I know it's only been a few days, but from your experience as a practitioner, what are you hearing in the exam room?
Yeah. So I saw patients Monday. I saw patients today. And yes, first question out of someone's mouth is, what's the story with the Tylenol thing? That is what people are asking about. And I think not only are pregnant patients asking about it, but people who I've seen who are recently postpartum who are saying, do I need to worry? Should I be doing any different screening? Do I need to tell my pediatrician? And I think we've created a level of anxiety that just is not founded in literature. And I think that that's what's the most upsetting part. And I've done many of these interviews. I've tried to get the word out. ACOG has put out a lot of guidance on social media and other places. But at the end of the day, when the government releases something, it goes everywhere. And so we are definitely seeing that patients are hearing this, and they're not always hearing the rebuttal. And so we now know that across the country, I've talked to colleagues in very many places around the country who are fielding phone calls. We are trying to come up with frequently asked questions for patients so we can get that information out as much as possible and help our members who are now being inundated with phone calls.
Of course, we experience this in journalism. Sometimes a mistake or a falsehood spreads farther and wider than the correction and the truth. And I'm wondering, I have two follow-up questions. And the first is what you mentioned about the meta-analysis. And I'm wondering, for folks who follow science, who know that there are advancements in our understanding of science and medicine on weekly, monthly, annual bases, there might be people who heard this press conference and think this is just the latest development, the latest uncovering of new information. We have found out in the past that things that we used to think were good for us, guidance can change. What's your response to people who hear this, think it's reasonable, and think it's the scientific method bearing out new guidance?
Yeah, I think it's really important for people to understand that there's no new study that came out. This is a compilation of many older studies. And one of the things that you cannot control for when you do a meta-analysis is how the study was designed exactly. And again, this gets to my comment about association versus causation. And so if you include a study that has, patients telling you, I took Tylenol in pregnancy or I didn't, in a retrospective, meaning looking back on their pregnancy maybe a year or two ago or 3 years ago, when they're looking at children with autism and looking at the parents, people don't remember necessarily what they took throughout an entire pregnancy. The reality is, when something is wrong, whether you have a child with a problem, whether you develop cancer later in life, whatever that reason is, when you ask someone, they will remember or try to remember everything they might have done that might have been a problem, and their recall is a little more detailed than when you take someone who's healthy, whose child is healthy, and say, did you take anything during the pregnancy? And their answer is very quickly, no, I was fine. I didn't take anything. I talk to people today where I say, are you on any medications? And I have the list in front of me, but I want to see if something changed. And they say, I don't take anything. And I say, really? Aren't you on these medications? Oh, yes, I am. And so I think that, it's really hard to use that type of a study. And that meta-analysis did include some retrospective trials. So no new data added to this. This is all old studies we've looked at over the last 20 years. It's just a compilation of them.
You hinted at something that I've been curious about. I have a friend whose child had a genetic abnormality, and testing has shown that there was nothing she or her husband could have done differently in conceiving the child and carrying the child. It's a fluke, honestly. But I think a lot of women blame themselves. What did I do? They track everything that they ate when they know that their child may have a condition as they're developing. Is an announcement like the one that the White House made on Monday something that could contribute more people blaming women for genetic abnormalities? You mentioned increased anxiety, so I'm just wondering what the effect could be on pregnant people going forward.
Yeah, I couldn't agree more with your sentiment on this. I mean, I see people all the time. They have a miscarriage. They go through everything they did for the days, weeks leading up to it to make sure that really nothing that they did, they're convinced it's their fault. And so to me, saying just, tough it out is just a way of honestly telling patients that if you do something, it's going to be your problem. And it's going to be because of what you did that caused this issue. And I can't stress enough that our patients don't deserve this. They do not deserve to be blamed or to be told, don't do something to take care of how you feel because you're going to do something to your baby. We just don't know that. I hope and I pray and I wish that HHS gives funding to NIH to really look at autism spectrum disorders to figure out what is going on. We're blaming it on a medication we've been trying to blame it on for over 20 years when there are so many other things we know about. We have different pesticides used in our foods. We have we're exposed to all sorts of things. We know that there are environmental toxins. We know that there's a genetic component to this. I'm sure there's an interrelation between all of this. We should be doubling down and focusing our energy on finding the real reason and what we can do about it. But going back to an old, blaming an old medication that we've been using for a long time, and autism was around a lot longer than acetaminophen's been around, I just find it really unsettling. And again, I couldn't agree more. The level of anxiety that this creates among people thinking they did something wrong when all everyone wants to do is take care of their pregnancy so that they have a healthy, happy baby.
Dr. Fleischman, we so appreciate your time today. Any final words of advice for people who may be watching and may be pregnant themselves or have a friend or family member who is experiencing some of the confusion and anxiety that you have referenced?
Yeah, I think the answer is what we've always been saying, which is if you don't need to take acetaminophen, you shouldn't take it. That's with all medications in pregnancy. We like people to be as healthy as they can during pregnancy. But if you get sick, that illness may cause a problem. And we need you to make sure that you're taking care of yourself. And if you're worried about it, pick up the phone and call your doctor's office. We in obstetrics are used to 24/7. People call us in labor all the time. We don't want you to be sick at home worrying and not taking a medication if you think you need it. So if you have a fever in the middle of the night, and some of my colleagues might not be happy, but if you have a fever at 2 a.m. and you're scared, pick up the phone and call the office. There's always someone available. And, I cannot stress it enough. Communicate with your physician. Get in touch with us. If you're worried, we will talk to you about this.
Talk to your physician. Dr. Stephen J. Fleischman, president of the American College of Obstetricians and Gynecologists, thank you so much for joining us. I know it's been a very busy week for you.
Thank you so much for having me on the show. Appreciate it.